We continue now at the top of Daf Chav Daled Amud Beis and Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 24b. And the previous Amud, the Gemara suggested that when it comes to nevelos and trefa, shkatzim, and ramasim, fundamentally they are considered edible. Therefore, when a person takes a shvuah that he's not going to eat, and he eats those items, he can be in violation of his shvuah. And the Gemara suggested that we see this from another case in the Mishnah as well. The Mishnah has a case where a person says his wife is going to be asura, is going to be prohibited if he ate today in the past tense. And so the halach is if he ate nevelos, trefa, shkatzim, or ramasim, that's considered to be eating, and so his wife actually is asura, she is prohibited. And so therefore you see that it is considered to be achila. But the Gemara says that's not really a proof, because in that case where it's in the past tense, if I ate today, so the fact that he ate that previously, chishuvei achshavei, that shows that he considered it to be a real achila, he considered it to be food that he was eating, he considered it to be of importance. But over here, when a person just takes a shvuah that he's not going to eat, there's nothing that indicates that he considered nevelos and trefos, shkatzim and ramasim to be things that really are eaten, because mi'achshave, he's never shown, he's never demonstrated their importance, and therefore you can't bring a proof from that case to our case over here. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, my time of demand the islay iser kolal. What's the reason of the one who holds of this idea of iser kolal? Again, iser kolal means, let's say, for example, nevelos are already aser, so a shvuah really shouldn't be able to be chal, but if other things were included in the shvuah, like kosher items, so then the shvuah is chal and includes the nevela as well. What's the reason for that? Midi dahavia iser mosif. It's similar to a situation of iser mosif. Rashi explains, Midi dahava iser mosif, demand de lesle iser chal al iser be iser kolal. The one who holds that iser is not chal al iser when it comes to kolal, isle be iser mosif kedaminan be yavamas. We do say that it applies by iser mosif, as we say in yavamas, and Rashi explains, iser kolal kari hecha de'in iser achron mosif al hachaticha klum. What iser kolal is that nothing is adding on to this particular piece. The nevela was aser before, and the nevela now that the shvuah is made is also aser. Nothing is being added to the prohibition on the nevela. Aval marbuhu iser al ha'adam b'dvar macherim. But there are other isurim that are being included on the person. That's what it means iser kolal. Kagon nevela b'yom haKippurim. For example, let's say nevela on Yom Kippur. The lo bala osra ela ba'achila. The Yom Kippur is only prohibiting the nevela. You can't eat it. Uva'achila kvar asurahi. Mishum nevela was already asur to eat it because it was nevela. Nimsa shalo hosef ale iser achron klum. So you see, he hasn't added any iser on the nevela itself. Aval riba isura al ha'adam la osra b'chola ochlin shaba'olam. But Yom Kippur is adding other isurim. He can't eat anything on Yom Kippur. V'yamrinan, we say migo dechol Yom HaKippurim ala adam la yasur b'shar ochlam mishum Yom HaKippurim. Once Yom HaKippurim takes effect that you can't eat other foods because of Yom Kippur, so kolal nami as a nevela imal ischayim mishum Yom HaKippurim. So now nevela also, there's a liability because of Yom Kippur. What's an example of iser mosif? Iser mosif is kisha iser achron mosif al chaticha atzma davar shelo hayabal yidei iser rishon. You had a prohibition on a particular piece of food, let's say, and then there's an iser mosif where there's a new prohibition that wasn't on that food. Something is being added. V'yoser hachaticha achron b'meshahoisem muteres kodem. That chaticha there was something that was mutter, now is aser. Sheba iser achron, again, you have this iser achron that comes in, this later iser that comes in. Rashi gives an example. Kagon, chaylev shel kodesh aser lechol mishum chaylev. Let's say you have chaylev of kodesh. You can't eat it because it's chaylev. Umutter legavor lemizbeach. However, you could put it on the mizbeach. Nasa noser. Now, when it becomes noser, when it becomes leftover, most of all of iser, now you're adding a new prohibition on this piece, on this chaylev. Lemashaysa to what it had before. Muteres lo, originally it was mutter to nifsal lehakrav, and now you're not allowed to bring it on the mizbeach. So you're adding something. It was usher to eat, but you were able to put it on the mizbeach. Now it becomes noser, you can't put it on the mizbeach as well. So we say as follows: since the iser of noser was able to be chal, now it can't go on the mizbeach. The first iser doesn't prohibit that from taking effect. Because it's not like the same iser is being chal. The iser of noser will also apply to anyone who eats it. If you eat this piece, you're not going to be chayiv liable for two, because it's chaylev and noser. Afal bi sheyesh kan iser chal iser, even though technically it's iser chal iser, but again that works by iser mosif. And so again, returning to the Gemara, Rava says, what's the reason of the one the islay iser kolal, who holds of iser kolal? Midi de have iser mosif, just like iser mosif, the iser takes effect, so to iser kolal. Uman de patar de lesle, and the one who says exempt, the one who says there is no iser kolal, the iser does not take effect. Ki yomar iser mosif b'chad chaticha, because where does iser mosif work? That's in the same piece, like Rashi just said. B'shtei chatichos lo, I mean, we don't say that by two pieces, and so therefore that's why by iser kolal it will not work. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav, and Rav says, L'man de isla iser kolel, according to the one who holds of iser kolel, Amar Shevuos shelo ochel ta'enim, let's say a person takes an oath, he's not going to eat figs. V'chazor v'yamar Shevuos shelo ochel ta'enim, v'yanavim, and then he takes a shvuah that he says he's not going to eat figs and grapes. So migo d'chayel anovim, since that second shvuah works on grapes, that was something added, chayel nami ta'enim, so it's also going to take effect in terms of the figs. You'll have two Shavuos when it comes to the figs. The Gemara says, Pshita, well, isn't that obvious? Again, that's exactly the case of iser kolel. And the Gemara says something that was mentioned on the previous summit. What might you have said? Isser haba me'elov amrinan, isser haba me'atzmo lo amrinan. Maybe we only say isser kolel by isser haba me'elov, something that happens automatically, like Yom Kippur. You have something that's an avela, and then Yom Kippur comes along. Yom Kippur happens on its own. But by isser haba me'atzmo, something that comes because of the person has to state the shvuah. He says a shvuah that he's not going to have ta'enim and he's not going to have anovim. That's not something that comes automatically. So maybe you would say over there we don't say isser kolel. So Kamash Malon, that's what Rav is teaching, that in fact we do say Isser Kolel in such a case. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Mesiv Rava Berei de Rabba, Rava the son of Rabba asked the following question. This is from a Mishnah in Krisos. The Mishnah says, Yesh ochel achila achas, there can be a situation where a person eats one thing, v'chayev ola arba chatos v'asham echad, and the person will be liable for 4 carbon chatases and 1 carbon asham. V'yelu hein, and they are as follows, Tamei she'achal chelev v'hu noser min ha'mukdashin b'yom ha'kipurim, somebody who's tamei and he eats chelev, which is also noser from hektish, and this all happens on Yom Kippur. And Rashi explains, Tamei she'achal chelev, again, a person who's tamei who eats chelev, chayev mishum chelev, so number one, no one's allowed to eat chelev, so that's one chayev. Umishum noser, and then there's also a chayev because of noser. Umishum yom kippurim, there's also a chayev of Yom Kippur. Umishum tamei she'achal es hakodesh, and also a tamei person is not allowed to eat kodesh. Harei arba chatos, that comes out to 4 chatos. V'yasham echad me'ilah, and the one asham, that refers to me'ilah, the misuse of hektish. V'yafilu hu kohen gabe chelev de kodesh moel, who even if he's a kohen, when it comes to chelev of kodesh, that's me'ilah. Diyamar mar, as the master said, kol chelev la'ashem l'rabos emurei kodshim kalim l'me'ilah. When you have the emurim of kodshim kalim, so there's a halacha of me'ilah that applies to those. And Rashi explains, Vahanu kulu isser chal al isser ninu. Now, all of these cases are an isser that's being chal on another isser, o al yedei kolol, either through the principle of kolol, which we've been discussing, o al yedei mosif, or through mosif, which again was mentioned above. Sharei misha nolda ha-beheim, and Rashi explains, when the animal is born, nesar chelba, so then you have the Isser of Chelev. Aktasha, now let's say you make it Hektish. So Migo dechal Isser Mukdoshim Abosor V'or, since the Isser of Hektish is Chal on the meat and on the hide, Chol Nami HaChelev, so that's also going to be Chal on the Chelev, on the fat. Hare Kolol, that's through Kolol. Havale Noser, so and then you have Noser, which is Migo, the Tosef Bo Isur Lagabe Mizbeach Al Chatichazu. When it comes to Noser, once you have added an Isser in terms of the Mizbeach on this, Mishum Noser, because of Noser, Itosef Nami Lagabe Gavra, Mishum Noser, the person also has now an added Isser as Noser. Hare Mosif, so then you have Mosif. Itma Gavra, and then when the person becomes Tamei, Migo de Itzer HaGavra Bekodshim HaNe'echolim Mishum Tuma, since this person is not allowed to have Kodshim and because of the fact that he's Tamei, Itzer Nami B'hai Chelev Mishum Tuma. So now he's also in this Chelev also because of Tuma. Hare Kolol, that's Kolol. And finally Rashi says, Havel Yom HaKippurim, when it comes to Yom Kippur, Migo de Itzar Af Bechulin Mishum Yom HaKippurim, because of the fact that Yom Kippur it's also to eat anything, even regular food, it's Nami behind Mishum Yom Kippurim. So this also applies because of Yom Kippur. Again, those are all the Isurim that apply in this case. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Meir says, Afim Hoisa Shabbos, we can add another violation. Let's say it happens to be Shabbos Votzio and the person carries it, so carrying on Shabbos Chayiv, that's another liability. Amrulo, they said back to him, Eino min Hashem, that's not included in terms of Achila. We're trying to find a bunch of violations in terms of Achila. You're adding one in terms of Hotzah, in terms of transferring from one Rishus to another Rishus. In any case, the Gemara asks, V'im Isa, now if it is true that you have the concept of Isser Kolal that can add on by a Shevuah, when you take an oath and you have Isser Kolal, that Shevuah can be Chal, so we can actually come up with another violation. Mashkachas lo chamesh, you can come up with a 5th carbon chatos. Kagon Shamar, for example, the person says, Shevuah shalo ochel tomorim v'chelev. Let's say he takes an oath, he says he's not going to eat dates and chelev, so migo dechayla tomorim, so we should say just like the Shevuah takes effect when it comes to the dates, chayla nami achelev, chalif, so it's also going to take effect when it comes to the chalif. And Rashi explains again. Rabbi Meir says, "Afim hoisa Shabbos, if it was Shabbos, dilo ahotzas Yom Kippurim." In terms of transferring from one rishus to another on Yom Kippur, lo mechayev, so there's no liability for that. The kasavar, because this Tana holds ein erev hotzah Yom Kippurim. There's no erev, there's no din of hotzah when it comes to Yom Kippur. That's only on Shabbos. V'hotzio befiv b'shas achila. Now the case over here is he's transferring it from one rishus to another with his mouth while he's eating it, and the response to that was eino min hashem ein chatazu ba mishum ha'achila. There the chatas is not because of the eating, ela mishum hotzah. It's because of the transferring from one rishus to another rishus. In any case, the Gemara then asks, "V'misa diamrinon kolel beisr haba me'atzmo." If it's true that we say kolel even by an isra that comes through what the person does, like taking an oath, akati havalei letana letfuye chatas. You should add on another chatas b'hai kazayis, by this kazayis again kagon shvua. For example, when the person takes an oath, etc. And the Gemara continues and answers, Ki katani, what is being listed in this Mishnah? Isser haba me'elav. It's only isurim that happen on their own, but Isser haba me'aso, but an Isser that comes because of what he did, like in this case when he takes a shvua, lo katani, that is not being listed in this Mishnah. But the Gemara questions this answer, Vare hektish, but what about hektish? That comes through the person's words. And the Gemara says, no, bevachor, we're talking about by a firstborn, the kedusha so me'rechem. There the kedusha comes from the womb. That's the kind of hektish that's being discussed in this Mishnah. Ibai same, if you want, I could say another answer. Kikatani midi de lesle she'ela. We're only listing things where there's no concept of she'ela. She'ela means, let's say, one can ask a court or a Talmud Chacham to undo a shvua that they make. So shvua de isle she'ela lo katani, shvua where there's a concept of she'ela, so that is not listed in this Mishnah. But the Gemara says, 1 second, hare hektish. What about hektish where there is she'ela? You can undo that. The Gemara says, no, ha'ukminan bevechor. We already said we're talking about the firstborn. That cannot be undone. The Gemara continues with another answer. By same, if you want, we can say kikatani karban kavua. We're only listing cases of karban kavua, meaning to say a chatos, that's kavua, you always bring an animal. But karban ola v'yored, when it comes to the sliding scale karban, lo katani, that we're not going to list over here. And again, if you'd have a case involving a shvua, that would be a karban ola v'yored. But the Gemara asks, hare tameh sha'achel as kodesh. But what about a person who's tameh, who eats kodesh, the karban ola v'yored? That is a karban ola v'yored. The Gemara says, no, benasi, we're talking about a nasi. There it's not a karban ola v'yored. It's Rabbi Eliezer, because it follows Rabbi Eliezer, the amar nasi mevi soyer. He says that in the situation of tamei shachal as kodesh, by a nasi, he brings a soyer. It is not a karban ola v'yored. The Gemara continues. Rav Ashi says another answer. Ki katani midi dechayla keshir. We're talking about something that is going to take effect with a minimum amount, with a minimum measure. Shavuot, when it comes to an oath, dechayla apachos mikashir, that actually takes effect even less than a shir of a kazayis, even by the smallest amount. Lo katani, that is not listed in this Mishnah. The Gemara asks on this answer, hare hektish. What about hektish? That is something that can be chal, even if it's not a kazayis. But the Gemara says no, havin and shava pruta. But there's a minimum shear. The shear by hektish the shear by hektish is a shava pruta. And the Gemara continues, V'Ravashi me'avira amar Rabbi Zeira, and Ravashi from Avira says that Rabbi Zeira says, Ki katani, what is listed in this Mishnah? Zidono kares, only things where when a person violates it on purpose, they would get kares. But zidono lav, but if a person would just violate a negative commandment by doing it on purpose, like a case of an oath, lo katani, that is not listed in this Mishnah. But the Gemara asks, V'harei yashim, but what about the yashim for me'ila? The zidono lav, v'katani, that is also a case where if it's done on purpose, it's a negative commandment, and that is listed in the Mishnah. And Rashi explains, Ki katani, again, the first answer was, what are we learning in the Mishnah? Afagav de islay kolel nami bisr haba me'atzmo, even though there's a concept of kolel by isser that comes from what the person says, like a shvua. Hachalo chashav el isurin haboim me'elein. But here we're only counting isurim that happen on their own. Vare hektish, the Gemara then asks, what about hektish? Asham me'ilos, that refers to the asham me'ilos, to asi le mishum diburo sheikdisho. That's because of his dibur, it's coming from him. The Gemara then gave an answer of she'ela l'chacham lahatira isser. We're not listing things where you can ask a chacham to undo it. Vare hektish, but hektish sheba al yedei neder. Hektish really is fundamentally a neder. V'chol nedarim yesh len sheila. All nedarim they have sheila. You can ask a chacham to undo it. And Rashi continues. The Gemara then said, "Ben nasi v'Rebbe Eliezer." He by a nasi when we're talking about tamei shachal as hakodesh. According to Rebbe Eliezer, again, there's going to be a fixed carbon there. It's not a carbon ola v'yored. The Meseches horios. That's in Meseches horios. For Amin and Hasan, we say over there, lo amar Rebbe Eliezer carbon kavua le nasi ba'aver the carbon ola v'yored ella b'tomas mikdash v'kadashav. Rabbi Eliezer only says this by Tomas Mikdash v'kadashav, that instead of a carbon olav yored, instead it's going to be the carbon kavua. Hol v'nemra bokare, since kares is mentioned over there, b'kavua avol b'shmias hakol uvevitois fasayim lo amar. But let's say by bitois fasayim, by things involving shavua, so there Rabbi Eliezer would not say it. There it actually would be carbon olav yored, which is why that is not mentioned in this Mishnah. Techayla pachos mikashir, and then the Gemara gave another answer that when it comes to Shavuot, that can take effect even on less than a minimum amount, but mefarish if that's explained. The Gemara asked on that, Hare hektish, well, what about hektish? Asha mi'ilos ba al shava pruta. Afilu pachos mikazayis, it could be less than a kazayis over there by Asha mi'ilos, because it goes by shava pruta, but the Gemara then answered, Habayin on shava pruta, well, at least you need it to be a shava pruta, v'hainu shire, so there is a minimum shir. Me'avirya is a makom, Avira is the name of a place. Asham mi'ila, and again, Asham mi'ila, there's a dono lav. The Asham mi'ila, there also the Gemara said that if you do it on purpose, it's a lo saseh. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayse, hazed b'mi'ila, if a person does mi'ila on purpose, Rebbe Omer b'misa, Rebbe says the punishment is misa, v'chachamim omer b'azhara, and the chacham say it's a warning. V'yamrin on my time of the Rebbe, and the Gemara over there says, what's the reason of Rebbe? The reason of Rebbe is, gamar chet mitruma di'ika azhara, umisa b'dei shamayim. He learns from truma gzeir shave, that there's misa b'dei shamayim over there. V'rabbanan amri, the Rabbanan say, amar krab b'truma, umesu bo ki yechalalu, bo v'lo b'mi'ila, they learned that it says bo, only over there by truma do we say that there's misa b'dei shamayim, not by me'ila, mimisa, mi'ate, it's excluded from misa b'dei shamayim, avol ba'azhara kayib migzer shave, to chet. But there is a warning, there is a lav, again, that's learned from the gzer shave of chet, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Hey Amud Aleph.